As we continue in our series, Life Lessons from Mr. Rogers, we start this sermon once again with a video clip, a video presentation. It is taken from Fred Rogers' commencement address to the folks at Dartmouth in 2002. Let us now watch with open eyes and ears. Good morning to you, our 8:30 worshipers, and I offer my words of welcome to those of you who will be viewing this sermon later here in the sanctuary, and for those who will be catching it on YouTube. If we haven't met before, my name is Jim Connor. Privileged to be one of the pastors here at the First United Methodist Church of Georgetown. We continue in this Lenten series, Life Lessons from Mr. Rogers. Just having seen that clip to the Dartmouth graduating class, I want to repeat the last few lines Fred offered. He said, when the runners finished the race at the same time, everyone in the stadium stood up and clapped and whistled and cheered for a long time. Why? Because deep down we know that what matters in this life is helping others win, even if it means slowing down and changing our course now and then. Now, that idea of slowing down and changing our course, the idea of slowing down so that we can help others, is a great lead-in to our message of the Good Samaritan story. But first, another story. A truck was stuck on the side of the road, and despite the driver's best efforts, no one would stop to help him. Finally, a Good Samaritan pulled over. What's the problem? My truck just broke down, and I don't know how long it will take before I get it running. And I have a bunch of penguins I'm supposed to take to the zoo. So he pulls out some money and hands it to the Good Samaritan. Here, I'll give you $50 if you'll do that for me. And so the Good Samaritan loads the penguins into his van and heads for the zoo. The truck driver just heaves a very big sigh of relief and continues his repairs. It's 2 hours later, and he sees that Good Samaritan driving down the road. And as he nears, he notices that the penguins are still in the back of the van. He flags him down. He said, I give you $50 to take those penguins to the zoo. What happened? And the Good Samaritan responded, well, we're finished with the zoo. I still have $10 left, and we're going to Dairy Queen. Not all of you are Dairy Queen fans, obviously. There really aren't many Good Samaritan jokes, so let us pray. Let now the words from my mouth and the meditations of our hearts and minds be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Who is my neighbor? In her book, The Simple Faith of Mr. Rogers, Amy Hollingsworth writes these words. Mr. Rogers' definition of neighbor was very simple. It was the person you happened to be with at the moment, whether that person was a Samaritan, a hermit bearing gifts, or a television viewer. And Fred said that we are to love our neighbors because every person is made in the image of God, and for that reason alone, he or she is to be valued. Well, the word neighbor for us is perhaps a little broader, and that's probably what was in the lawyer's mind when he came to ask Jesus about it. He must have thought to himself, surely Jesus didn't think neighbor meant everybody. Who is my neighbor? I think that you and I have also asked that same question, haven't we? Who are the people that deserve my attention? Who are the people I'm supposed to notice? Who are the people I'm supposed to see, that I'm supposed to help? The lawyer is looking for limits and guidelines because he wants to obey the law. The reality is it's hard for each and every one of us not to encounter human need each and every day. But we can't respond to every need, can we? So many needs and wants out there, so many different people, so many mouths to feed, so many wounds to heal. And then we're not always sure that all of those requests and needs are authentic. So what do? I do what you do. I often drive by or walk to the other side of the street, which could be why this Good Samaritan story is one that haunts me And it's probably also why it's one that I think of more often than any other story in the Bible. The lawyer was interested in getting into heaven. What must I do to inherit eternal life? The Samaritan, on the other hand, was interested in providing aid to someone in need. Now, that's a two-sentence synopsis of the story. The lawyer is interested in getting to heaven. The Samaritan was interested in providing help to someone in need. But let's dig a little deeper, shall we? As with most of the stories of Jesus, how we enter the story often affects how we experience its meaning. Well, we're there right in the front. We're the ones with the robes. We're the priests. We're the pastors who walk in and walk right on by. It's not a very good place to be in the story. I'm reminded of an illustration that came out a number of years ago, and it was inspired by the parable of the Good Samaritan. There was a social psychologist at Princeton who wanted to study how the students at the Princeton Theological Seminary conducted themselves when they were asked to deliver a sermon on this very passage, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the students who were to give the sermon were asked to get ready in this room, and then they were to go across campus to this other studio where they were going to be filmed. And as each student was finalizing their preparations for that sermon, they got one of three different messages. The first message was, "You're late. They were expecting you a few minutes ago." The second message was, "The assistant is ready for you, so please go right over." And the third message was, "It's still a few minutes before they'll be ready for you, but you might as well head over now." As each student walked out of that preparation room and headed to the studio for the filming, they encountered a victim in a deserted alleyway, just like the wounded traveler in the parable of the Good Samaritan. They were alone and witnessed this. This victim appeared destitute, was slouched and coughing, and clearly in need of assistance. And so these seminarians were offered a chance to make real that story of the Good Samaritan. And you know how they did? In the first group, 10% stopped to provide aid. Seminary students, 10% of them stopped. I was pretty proud that 60% of the ones who said, "It's no hurry, just take your time, just get there soon," stopped. But that's still 40% who didn't. And the researchers concluded this: a person not in a hurry may stop and offer help to a person in distress, but a person in a hurry is likely to keep going, even if they were a person who is a pastor or a pastor wannabe, even if they're about to preach on the parable of the Good Samaritan. So thinking about the Good Samaritan did not increase their helping behavior. Being in a hurry decreased it. And so we hear those words again that Fred offered to that class at Dartmouth. It is a good thing for us to slow down and to change our course. That's the way that we can make sure that everyone wins, and everyone wins together. What do we do if we enter the story in a different place than that of the priests who were walking by? When we often tell a story, I think of stories where we invite people to put their self in a particular lineup or where they want to be. If you ask a bunch of sixth grade boys what position they want to play in football, what do you think they say? Exactly right. Basketball player? Okay, now some of you played. It's shooting guard. Come on. It could be any of the five. But in this story, which would you think people would choose? Who would they want to identify with? Okay, it's early. I know that, but the Good Samaritan. Show of hands. Good Samaritan? Okay. All right, you're gonna have to work better with me for two reasons. Number one is normally I know I'm supposed to be done preaching at 15 minutes after the hour, which is 9:15. But the clock back there says 8:08, so I can make this go. Okay, so no, you don't want to do that yet. Thank you so very much. We want to be the Good Samaritan because that's the person that stopped. That's the one that showed compassion. That's the one that was Christ-like. That was the one that was faithful. That's the one that was caring. But in reality, maybe we need to identify with someone else in that story. Maybe that person needs to be the person lying in the ditch on the side of the road. How does the story change for you if that's the person that we are? And in many ways, isn't that the person who we are? Aren't we hurting? Haven't we struggled? Haven't we been in need of a caring hand, of a kind word, of someone just to stop, to look into our eyes and ask, is there anything I can do for you? You know, when we think about that person lying on the side of the road in the story doesn't say a word. Maybe he couldn't say a word because they were half dead, at least that's the description. But if that person who was beat up and naked, and if that person could have spoken, do you think that person would have looked at the person, the Samaritan, stopped and said, I need to know your religious belief, and I need to know where you're from before I'm going to let you help me? In a world in which we live in, where we have such a hard time sometimes with people we don't know, with people who may look different than we do, or come from the other side of the tracks, the town, the country, the world, when it comes time to both giving and receiving aid, we better all be colorblind. We better all be more attuned to the fact that we are called to engage, to either receive or to give. Because both in giving and receiving, there's change, there's transformation, there's hope, and there's love. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Jesus asked the lawyer. The lawyer's pretty smart, and his answer was reluctant, but he said the Samaritan was his neighbor. We need to remember who the Samaritans were. They were the outcasts. They were the heretical outcasts. They only believed the first 5 books of the Bible. The devout Jews, wanted nothing to do with them. And the devout Jews believed that there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. But we know better. We've heard the story. The Samaritan would answer the question, who is my neighbor? By saying, my neighbor is a person in need. In the Good Samaritan story, the movement is from exclusivity to inclusiveness. The potential care providers in the story move from the exclusive priest and Levite who will only be willing to stop for their people. And then there's the Samaritan who could care less whose people they were. They were God's people. And so he stopped. And that is why the Gospel of Luke is my favorite of all the Gospels, because it is the gospel of inclusion. We have learned that the identity of our neighbor is defined only by need in this story. We've learned that compassion begins with seeing and it ends in doing. And we've learned that effective compassion is expressed in very practical ways. But it means we have to stop. It means we have to see. And sometimes it means we have to provide food and clothes and medical care. Now, I know the first two in the story had all kinds of excuses for not stopping, but I could care less about those excuses. You see, we're really good at making excuses too, aren't we? But the reality is, by not stopping, they fail to act. By not stopping, we fail to act. By not stopping, they fail to see. By not stopping, we fail to see. And by not stopping, they fail to love. And by not stopping, we fail to love. This parable in Luke started out with a question about how to get to heaven. And then it detoured into defining the neighbor that I must love. And then it ends with an explanation of how we are to be a neighbor. We live in a world that continues to build fences and to draw lines in the sand that separate us from those who might be a little different. We still tend to think sometimes in terms of who the other is or who the outsider is, believing all along that we are the insider and the one that belongs. But I want you to keep thinking about this story as if you're the person on the side of the road who is beaten and who's in need, and then recognize that you would desperately take aid, receive love and care from anyone who would stop by. Everyone in the story knew their place, and yet, who do we know who we would call another Good Samaritan? Wasn't Jesus a Good Samaritan? Certainly Jesus never hesitated to stop on the road and to heal somebody or to stop by and look in someone's eyes and ask them what they needed. Certainly Jesus never hesitated to stop and say, "Take up your mat and walk. You're forgiven. You're healed." Jesus did not exclude in any way, shape, or form. One of the parts of this story that kind of scared me, a commentary asked me to read it this way, asked all of us to read it this way. It says that the two who stopped right on by, there are precisely two verbs, you can count them, that they use in describing what they did. They saw and they passed by. Two verbs for the priest and for the Levite. Whatever else they might have thought, said, had faith in, or believed, all they did was they saw and they passed by. The Samaritan, there are 14 verbs. I'm going to let you count that yourself sometimes. But the most important of the verbs was the one for which everything else seemed to tie in. The one thing the Samaritan did that set him apart from the two predecessors so that everything else could happen was that he came near the man. Dear friends, we live in a very difficult time right now because we recognize that there are sometimes some bad things that can happen if we're near folks who may have a disease or a cough. But it doesn't mean that we live in fear. It doesn't mean that we close our doors, lock our doors, don't answer our phone. It doesn't mean that we don't go to church. But it does mean we're careful. But in order for us to be good neighbors, we have to be willing to go over, to greet, to meet, to ask if there's a need. When our children's department put together their guide for families for the Lenten series, they talked about different ways we could identify neighbors who are different than us, neighbors in our families, neighbors in our church, neighbors that are friends, neighbors in our community, neighbors around the world. But the emphasis was being authentic neighbors. I think children have a much easier time of doing that than we do sometimes because they're always themselves. And they don't have that kind of fear in running over to someone they don't know and saying hi and making a face. We need to be more childlike in that way, I think. Just think for a second if our entire congregation, all 2,000 members, found one person they could go over and be a good neighbor to. Now let me do that math. 2,000 times 1. That's 2,000 people. And if it's not one person we go over, it's a whole family, that's 2,000 plus some more. Gosh, we have a great and important responsibility, a great opportunity to change the world by being good neighbors, by our willingness to maybe step out of our box, step out of our comfort zone, and go introduce ourselves to people we don't know. Or perhaps stop as we see a need. And even if we don't feel comfortable stopping and getting out of the car, we can stop, roll down the window, and ask if we can make a call for somebody, or if we can send some other kind of help. Please, don't believe that every situation that you see is a scary one for you. When we see need, we really do need to do something about it. So think about what you might do. Even if it's not stopping, think about praying. Think about maybe making a call. Think about making a difference. Think about being a good neighbor. As our Nike advertisers so clearly spelled out years ago, what are we supposed to do? Just do it. Love God. Love a neighbor. Be a neighbor. If you want the world to look different the next time that you go out into it, do love. Amen.